Well, welcome everyone to our October coffee chat. I'm Laura Knutson-Murray. I'm the GIS coordinator and community outreach assistant with IrisBG. With us today is Shanna Jones, social media and community outreach assistant, and Irvin Rustin, the founder and CEO of IrisBG. The recording and presentation and other material will be made available in our knowledge library. As with all of our other previous coffee chats, they can be found under the category Articles and Presentations. You can follow the topic IrisBG Coffee Chats and be notified via email anytime something new is published. The idea for these sessions is that we at IrisBG would like to offer you a space where you can connect with your peers and have a chat about IrisBG and any issues that may arise with your work, with your collection. We don't have a fixed format for these, so please get in touch with us if there's something that you would like to present, or if there's a challenge or a topic that you would like the community to take on. It can be anything, big or small. And hopefully today you will make some new connections, and together we might become a little bit wiser. Please take a moment to answer our poll. We have our regular IrisBG experience poll. What is your level of experience using IrisBG? Are you trying out the trial? Are you a novice, intermediate, or advanced? Just gives us a snapshot of who's here today. And then we have another dual poll. So there are two questions. How many staff members do you currently have that are solely dedicated to plant record? Looks like most everyone on the call has one plant records person. So the second question is, how long has the full-time plant records position been filled at your institution? Looks like a good split. A third have less than a year of a full-time plant records person. A third is 1 to 4 years, and a third is 10 or more years. So a good mix of institutional knowledge with plant records. So thank you. Thank you for taking our little poll. Our agenda today, we have two guests sharing a screen. So we'll be talking about, from a director's perspective, why plant records professionals add institutional value. And we're really glad to have Chad Franer from Newfields. He is the Tom and Nora Hiatt Director of Horticulture. And with him is Jaime Fry, who's the Associate Curator of Living Collections. So I'm glad to have you both. Jaime has a really great story to share, and they have a fantastic working relationship, as you'll see in the presentation. And then afterwards, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So without further ado, I will give the screen share over to you, Jaime.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having us today. So as the lovely introduction from Laura said, I am Jaime Fry. I'm the Associate Curator of Living Collections here at Newfields. And I have with me Chad Franer, who's going to kind of take over partway through the presentation. I'll let him do his own intro at that point. So I'm going to start with kind of an overview of the history of plant records, the timeline of plant records on our campus, and talk a little bit about Newfields. I'll let Chad sort of introduce himself and his role, and then he and I are going to have a little chitty chat. I have some questions for him about his experience, and yeah, we'll open it for Q&A afterwards. So let's get rolling. And Laura, it's fine that we pause or something glitchy happens. Holler at me. So yeah, Newfields, if you're not familiar with us, we are a 152-acre cultural campus just north of downtown Indianapolis. We have a 100-acre art and nature park that's largely focused on ecosystem, land reclamation, and large-scale modern art. We have a 52-acre garden that includes the gardens around a 4-story encyclopedic art museum, as well as a 26-acre historic estate. So we are a large place with lots of things going on. And I always enjoy sort of telling a little bit about our history for kind of some context as to who we are and how we got to where we are now. So our historic estate, the land was purchased from a farmer in 1908 by Hugh Lambden, and they built their house and the sort of garden areas immediately surrounding the house, including a formal garden and a small sort of orchard cut vegetable garden area between the years 1908 and 1913. So the on the screen is of the historic home, which is now called the Lily House, with the surrounding drives, but there's not a lot of landscape. So all 152 acres at the time the land was purchased in 1908 was agricultural fields, so farm fields, wheat fields. So it was fairly flat, fairly featureless, with not a lot going on garden-wise. So at the time of the Country Place Estate era, they would have had a gardener, some seasonal help, as well as the other folks that lived and worked on the estate. In the 1920s, that's when our landscape started to really develop. Hugh Landon's second wife, Jessie Landon, and he were on their honeymoon in Maine. And she was really inspired by a ravine garden that she saw there. So they started writing letters back and forth to the Olmsted Brothers firm and the specific designer, Percival Gallagher, who had designed that garden in Maine, and asked him to come design their ravine garden behind the home in 1920. They liked that garden so much that they hired him on to do the entire estate plan. So you can sort of see in these historic photos, this is the start of our border gardens, which are on either side of our long alley in front of the house, back in their little itty bitty stages after they were first planted. So it does not look like that today. 100 years later, we are under full, really dense conifer canopy in these garden spaces. But again, that would have been a set of gardeners caring for the landscape at the time, really for a single family to enjoy. This is a aerial photo from 1933 when the estate changed hands from the Landon family to the Lilly family of Lilly Pharmaceuticals. So you can see the landscape has grown up much more, but similarly, that kind of estate garden ethos of it's productive, it's beautiful, it's for a family and their guests to enjoy. We have some really great archival letters and plant lists and plans from that original 1920s Olmsted Brothers planting, but that is about it in terms of plant records from about those 1920 eras all the way forward. So in 1972 is when the institution was given and then opened to the public. So the Lilly family donated all of the land on the upper campus, so those 52 acres of gardens, to the Indianapolis Art Association, right? Or the Art Association of Indianapolis, I can never remember how it goes, for them to build their museum up here. So that opened to the public in 1972, at which point it was started being utilized as a public garden. And then when I was preparing for this presentation, I was sort of thinking through the timeline of sort of plant recorders and the plant records legacy, of which there isn't a ton. And in the 1980s is when somebody got a really wild hair and decided that they wanted to be super, super specific and wrangle some plant records into shape. I found this great box of old card catalog accession records. But it was sort of a little blip in time of incredible specificity that seems like it didn't totally last. In that late 80s period, that's when it started transitioning into an access database. But largely, as the gardeners were trying to maintain this large public garden, there wasn't a huge emphasis on the records, more so on the aesthetics, the design, the beauty of the space. So in 2014, I moved here for my husband's job. I had been doing plant records on the East Coast for a while. Chad's laughing at the quote I put on the screen. And so when we moved here, basically I showed up like a wet puppy on Chad's doorstep and said, hey, you don't have one of me. You don't have anybody specifically focused on the records, all of the database management, sort of maintaining that workflow and that information base. And so I actually volunteered part-time. I had a part-time at a garden center gig and just said, hey, I'm gonna kind of show up and start doing the work and annoy you until you hire me. And this quote is actually from our CFO. So our volunteerism manager, when he was interviewing here, our CFO sort of jokingly, cheekingly was like, hey, now that we've hired her, she is the biggest failure of our volunteerism system. We're paying her to do her job now. And it was a silly CFO joke that I'm sure Chad does not feel the same sentiment as. So in 2016, Chad was able to hire me on as an assistant horticulturist. So at that time, I was probably spending 60 or 70% of my time out in the garden helping the gardeners and the horticulturists with their work, everything from planting, weeding, watering, while maintaining the records as much as I could on sort of rainy days, winter days, with inclement weather. And then as the years sort of ticked on, by 2018, I was doing records more or less full time. The record keeping isn't the only thing I do as part of my job. There's lots of other pieces that tie into it. But basically all things plant information and plant storytelling are now under my purview, more or less full time. So it's been a really interesting journey to kind of get here. I am still wrangling with the legacy of decades and decades and decades of a lack of records and a lack of consistent procedures. So I'm still finding things in the database that either were planted in the early 1990s, that there's no way in heck they're still alive, but they're still listed in there because they've never been tidied up. Or sometimes we're doing things like tree work on large extant heirloom trees that have never been listed in the database. They've probably been here for 100+ years, but because it's something we've either never purchased in or there's an oversight in the record, they just don't exist in our paper. So a lot of times I tell people that my job is to try to make the digital lists reflect reality as close to possible, and that my role is to get that closer and closer and closer as I can. So I'm going to let Chad introduce himself a little bit. He's laughing because he didn't really get a choice in the photos that I used of him here. So I'm going to let Chad introduce himself and his role, and then he and I'll kind of chit-chat a little bit more about, you know, what it's like to have a plant recorder.
Thank you, Jaime. Well, as you can see, my job is to try to keep up with Jaime because she is on it and particular about how things are done, which is what we've needed for years. I started here in 1998 as a horticulturist. So I've been here 26 years and have moved from horticulturist to a garden manager, then horticulture director. And the time lapse of that is night and day. From when I started, basically each horticulturist would kind of keep records, and it came down to more of what we were buying, more so than what was existing or what was dying. It was more of what we were buying. That was the important part to us at that point. And trying to have 5 different horticulturists, 4 or 5 different horticulturists working in a system as simple as Access, things were still not going with rules to where they were solid as far as how accurate they were. The whole idea was more about working on plant orders than it was plant accession or an accession record. And then since then, we've had always been a garden, but I would say we've gotten more a part of Newfields as a whole versus there's always this kind of dichotomy between the art at the museum and the gardens. And our former director was very focused on a historic aspect of it, which was great, because that's why we have a National Historic Landmark now status and most of what we already have. And some of that was just working on true garden restoration or garden renovation of those things that we didn't have exact plans for. So we would continually work on different gardens as we go through, and then structures as well, houses and things like that. And always looking back at images and records, but not as much focus on plant record. There's a big gap between as she mentioned, the plant records that we got from the designers, which changed a little bit from when they were actually planted. But there was a huge gap between the 30s to the 80s. And in the 80s, that's about when they started putting some records down, but it was done by horticulturalists. And we had a labeling system that was pretty shoddy. You just kind of go into a little closet, and that was where your little plastic engraver was at that time. So I came from the nursery background originally, prior to starting here after school, and then I got into public gardens. This was my first public gardening job at the time. And it was, for me, all about learning new plants and being able to play with different types of plants. Now it's a totally different scene where we're doing displays where we didn't do a spring display before. So now we'll put anywhere from 50 to 100,000 bulbs in a year and have annual change outs of 20,000 in the spring and probably more than that in the summer. And each horticulturalist is responsible for their own areas. That includes design, which is not typical with a lot of other gardens I know. Design, install, maintenance, care for all of the garden plants. Now I kind of I have a little section in the garden, so I still do garden some. So I get that little release there. But I'm more working on master plan projects now and focusing on what we're doing in the future more so than in the past.
Well, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen so Chad and I can chat a little bit. So Chad sort of mentioned this idea of being more focused on the plants that they were ordering and less so focused on maintaining records and accessioning. And that is very much the case. So when I came on board in 2014, what they had was an access database that was basically operating like an Excel spreadsheet that was their order tracking more than anything else. So everything that they were ordering got sort of plugged into this spreadsheet, but it wasn't really then ground truth or dealt with much afterwards. So it was like a very specific snapshot in time. And I like to tease Chad that I'm probably the most expensive employee he's ever had, because I showed up and was like, great, we need a laser engraver, we need a database, we need all of these different things. And like I said, sort of irritated him until we got all of the things. So my first question that I was going to ask was sort of that primer of what plant records looked like when I started here, but I feel like have kind of covered that.
Yeah, I would agree. The access database was more of a plant record or plant ordering sheet, but we didn't go back to it. We would order that stuff, and then there might be a sub, or it never came, and we didn't have the time to go back to it. So
yeah, we all know that the reality of what comes off the truck is often very different from the things that we requested or even sometimes the invoices that we had. So it was a couple of the work staff that were sort of interested in kind of managed it as their winter project, more or less. But then, yeah, there wasn't a lot of that continued up. So I want you and your sort of history here. Tell me a little bit about how your relationship or your view of plant records, plant recording, what it is, the sort of utility of it has changed across. Because I imagine it's very different now than it was 20 years ago or before me.
Yeah. So as I started managing the garden, my focus was, we're not taking care of this. We've got to get this done. We've got to start this new project. So plant records was pretty low on the list, I have to say, in the beginning. And then as we actually started turning the tide a little bit more and the garden became more visual to the entire institution, and we had a director change also, this became very important for us to be able to tell the story of what we're planting, and not only the history from 100 years ago that these trees we have here, but the renovations that we've done since. And we started doing a little bit heavier plant record when we started working on our ravine garden, because that was our biggest restoration that we've done. About an acre garden, but we had exact plans. So we would put back exactly what was on the plan from 1920s. And that one, we actually started kind of a garden diary, I guess you'd say. Why did you pull it? Why did you substitute this and that? Some of it was invasive stuff. Some of it was East Coast natives that didn't do well here in limestone soil. So it was a kind of, as we were going, that became more important. When Jaime got here, it really opened my eyes much more, because we have a go-to person for advancement, interpretation, all of these other institutional departments that we have that come and ask us questions, and then are like, well, make sure you run it through Jaime so that we're not putting the wrong text to a flower that's in the magazine for the month or the year ending. And so we had a kind of a clearinghouse with Jaime to be able to manage all of that. And then it developed into more interpretation, working with our spring blooms showcase in the spring, and kind of telling the stories to our visitors about how and why we're.
Yeah. And so when people ask me sort of what my role is here, a lot of times the short version that I tell them is I make sure that our horticulturists have everything they need to do their amazing, creative, incredible jobs, right? I make sure that plants come in. I work with our vendors. I make sure our vendors get paid. But then I also get the blessing of being able to tell the world about how cool they are and how amazing their work is. So I kind of think of myself as the before and after what the work staff get to do, which is really cool. And then before I move on, I also just want to mention that the ravine garden that Chad mentioned, so this was that first garden that was installed by Percival Gallagher in 1920. They did a complete like-for-like renovation in 1999, and I will say from a record standpoint, that is the garden that scares me the absolute most. Because it is so historically accurate, we have layers and layers and layers of the same plant being added back year after year after year. And I still haven't figured out a good way to rectify that from an inventory standpoint. Because, for example, I will have 8 accessions of the same aster that has been layered in the same place across 2 decades at this point. And so if anybody has any thoughts on the best curatorial way to rectify that in its inventory, that might be a different coffee chat or a different conversation altogether. So we're going to kind of move on with the conversation. That was a little plant nerd sidebar there. So what were your first thoughts when I came on board and when I started making big changes? Because change is scary. I kind of came in guns blazing.
I was not scared at all. Actually, I didn't think of them as changes. I thought of them as how we will have to operate. So it was more of, I was happy to have somebody managing it and keeping it from the orders to what's arriving and what's going in the ground. So I felt that was important. And it also gave me a big lift of, you would come to me, you're like, Chad, did you put a tree in the border garden back in 2000 in the back? It's an oak. I'm like, oh yeah, okay. Then I can dump some of this institutional knowledge that I have into her brain, and then it gets actually put into the records properly. And so it's a savior. Yeah, it was great.
And I feel like the institutional knowledge portion of this is really significant in both gardens that have a really deep legacy of long-term staff. So we're really lucky here. A lot of our staff has been here in that 20 plus year range from the horticulture side of things. So we have an incredible depth of institutional knowledge, but also for gardens with younger staffs that see a lot of turnover, getting all of this information in writing and getting it accurate in a way that people can access it and get a feeling for why something was done or how something used to be, or even, what's there currently, and get their feet under them, I feel like is really important for the long-term health of an organization. Okay, so here's the fun sort of awkward question. So what made you decide that both hiring me initially and then shifting me to like full-time curation and plant records work was kind of worth it? What were some of those key things that persuaded you over the years? Because I've been here a long time now. You've been stuck with me for almost a decade.
So this is where hopefully I can make her cheeks turn purple, because it's been a great run for being able to expand upon just plant records, working with our advancement team, having a system set up to where we can actually track extant trees, and we start to develop record keeping or treatments that we're doing to trees, that we're treating it for emerald ash borer or root rot or something like that. That's a big help in our tree preservation, because with 100-year-old trees, I feel like I'm in the depth of trees at this point, because some of them are getting to this age that they're starting to die out, and we're trying as hard as we can to protect them and give them all of the things needed for them to survive most. But she's also spread into that interpretation where I talked about. Working with our interpretation team from a museum standpoint was great, because she shows the professionalism in horticulture and mimics it the way that they run a 600,000 square foot museum that had been here since the 1880s, or been in the city since the 1880s. Developing the collection policy, I think that is in the collection plan on why we have certain gardens and what we're going to do with them and what we want to watch out for, or when we need to renovate them. That's been a great help. The GIS work that she's done, this is something that she's hesitant about doing, I know. It doesn't have the time to do, but she's willing to start it and take it on a little bit, and tying that with the rest of the institution. Now we are actually pitching to have a full-time person to try to work on just GIS throughout the institution, because it's such, I mean, you can imagine with as many outbuildings we have and utilities and all of the processes that we have, and it's invaluable. Every time we go to do something, you can look back at a certain plan. So the mapping, she'll create maps for our advancement department with our bench dedications or our tree dedications. Those can be updated. And what we found is the redundancy is huge for us. Yes, advancement might have some record keeping, but it's in a different system, and having somebody else keep it in our own system, then you have some resiliency there. And that goes for anything. Sometimes it'll be just for what we call bloom struck, which is a dedication for our containers. That's some of the labels for. That's again working with our advancement department, and just getting those out and get it planned out and showing the mapping of where they're at. That's been an incredible help. She's kind of the go-to person for anybody in the museum field. Well, you should just ask Jaime, because she has the records, and she also is very rambunctious about getting out there and finding out the solution in the asset.
Truth finding.
Truth finding. Yes, we'll go with that. The plant orders are a huge help. The gardeners kind of inserted into just an Excel sheet, and then she combs it to make sure that it's accurate. We're not always, we'll get close on the spelling, and she makes it right. She will make, we do quite a bit of festivals here, so she'll help by making maps on where signage might go, and each individual department we'll have a contact with Jaime so that we can kind of work more as a team as a whole. It's a big institution, 350 or more people here. So it's always moving. So she grounds us with all of her work.
Yeah, so that was one of the biggest first steps that I did kind of coming on board in what it would have been 16 or 17, was taking that ordering process and separating it from the database. So we had that Access spreadsheet, and that's pretty much what I developed into what's now our ordering spreadsheet. So I'm able to give each of our horticulturists a blank copy of it every season for ordering. And I say, great, put everything that you want, all of your vendors, have it sourced, have it priced out, all that good stuff. Put that all in that spreadsheet. And then I collate it and kind of do the back and forth with our vendors. Part of it is making sure for, Chad's sake that we're on track budget-wise. But then also a lot of it is, somebody is trying to order a dahlia from a nursery in Australia. Like I'm not doing the import paperwork for 3 dahlia tubers from Australia. Like it's not happening. It's not happening. But being able to sort of be that stopgap person that sort of has their hands in it and is looking at it from a holistic view. But it also helps me as the plant recorder because I'm not just getting invoices for things after the fact. Because I'm on the front side of the plant ordering, I also have all of that data and a good idea of what's coming in and what the intentions were behind it. So to give you sort of a sense of scope, we do about 20,000 annuals in the spring. So your pansies, kale, all that fun stuff. And then we do about 40,000 for summer. And for summer, between woodies, perennials, and seasonal display items, we have about 60 plant shipments that come in between mid-April and the end of May. So it's busy. It's a lot. It's a lot to maintain and take care of. And I'm not sure how y'all managed before. And the volume has increased over the last 10 years as well. So Jenna asked a really good question that was also a similar one to kind of the tying it up question that I had wanted to ask you, which is, how do you convey the value of this work, this position to people like, board members or Jonathan or, the people who are the decision makers in terms of, okay, this is valuable. We want to have this position. It's important.
I think it comes down to, do you want it to be a professional garden? Or do you want it to be at its highest level, like you would ask for a registrar in the art world? It's easy to compare those positions with what we already have in the museum, and then being able to tell those stories and be able to come back and say, like, oh yeah, here's your tree that was dedicated 40 years ago. That is a huge, or it was your parents that donated it. And hopefully they may be covered order themselves. They may come back and look at that sort of stuff. But it's really about being the best that we can be. And it's easy to look at this as paperwork, but it is a lot of data, but it is about keeping it accurate and being able to tell that story. So it's not too hard to sell it. It's a budgetary need.
Yeah, and I think there's also so many tie-ins with Sarah. You just made a great comment about telling the story, right? And so much of what our other institutional colleagues do, their roles are to tell and to sell a story, right? So our advancement and development teams, they're working with the donors, and they need to tell the story of the garden, the institution, the collection. And so there's a few different avenues, at least that we've discussed over the years. One of it being that donor development side of things, it's hard to manage and control all of that information over a long course of time. And so to have that information accessible and organized and easy to craft a story around, I think is really important. And then also because we are an art institution as well, like Chad was saying, there's this idea of treating our garden as a living collection. So it's not just a garden. It's not just there to be pretty. That is a big part of it, right? Is to create those exceptional experiences, but to do that at the highest level, we need to be able to understand what we have and what we're doing with it.
Yeah, this can't be a group project or volunteer work. It has to have somebody's consistent time and protocols, or it's not going to work right. If it's not consistently set up the same way each time, then the records are going to go off.
Okay, so Jenna asked, was plant records at the table in leadership meetings early on to convey the power of that sort of clearinghouse, that one-stop shop?
You try to tell the stories as far as why you need staffing. And I think you're going to put them in a position to where little understanding how you want a high caliber garden to look requires the database and the record keeping that IrisBG provides. Otherwise, you're going to end up not knowing what's coming in, what's going out, what plants are, and then that lets you just kill a profession at that point. And I don't think that any board member or director or any museum or any other institution, that's the last thing they want to see is anything that's waffling when a donor is asking something particular about something. You want to be able to get on the straight, consistent, constant answer.
Would you also say that it alleviates some burden from the other horticulturist staff, the horticulturists, the gardeners, things like that?
Oh, yeah. Because we basically here's our orders. And then, I still work with some of the nurseries to try to do some of the ordering because I have certain contacts. But for the most part, I just wait for them to show up. And then we're like, oh, yeah, I forgot I ordered that one. We'll put that one in still. So it is a great relief for the staff, partially because we know that it's getting done right. And we know that we can rely on you. Usually the radio call goes out, Jaime, you're at your desk, which usually we don't. We try to keep a little chain on her and not get her too far from the desk so we can ask questions that we're out in the garden. Do you remember 3 years ago we put this Hiatt come in and the cultivar in, and she'll dig it up for us because sometimes it's questions we're getting from a guest that's in the garden that day. We may not be in the garden space that we're managing, or we may have forgotten the cultivar name, and she'll pull that up, and that makes a great experience for a guest to be able to know right off the bat exactly what they're looking at and exactly what they want to go buy something.
And then our dear friend Sarah had another question, our friend whose name pops up on everybody's, about best practices for starting a database and anything that I wish I had known and recorded. So my best sort of piece of advice there is talking to people in this meeting, right? So every institution is a little bit different in terms of their collection, their needs. I know for us, I was sort of working with institutionally what had been there and trying to morph it towards that best practices standard. And when we were looking at databases, that was actually a huge part of it was, okay, I need something that can wrangle this and has enough depth and utility to really get some meat out of it and not just have it be that flat singular table. But I also needed it to be something that if I win the lottery and don't come back tomorrow, I can have documentation on and somebody can pick up in my stead, right? It needs to be easy enough for the gardeners that want to utilize it regularly. And I do have a couple of super users, at least super users in terms of our team, to be able to get in and feel empowered to get their own data. We are sort of at a point institutionally where when I came in, I said, look, I will take information however you will give it to me, right? This is a new position. It's a new thing to get used to, right? Having somebody do this. So I have some people that will leave me sticky notes on my desk. I get a lot of Chad sticky notes. I have some people that will call me on the radio when they're out there doing it. I have some people that will write me lovely poetry via email. I don't care, just get me the information. And yeah, so it's basically figuring out what works best for your garden, your institution, and developing those protocols as you sort of need them. It's great to have it all set up and ready to go from the get-go, but that's not the reality for most of us, unfortunately. All right, John. So John asked if I'm the assistant or associate curator. Do we have a curator? If so, what does that person do? So our curator, really, Chad functions as our woody curator, more or less. Chad is our go-to for all things woody, especially trees when we're looking at, the long-term siting, long-term decision-making for our large tree collection. Chad functions as our woody curator. And then our actual titled curator, Irvin, has been here for over 30 years. He's our curator of seasonal displays and herbaceous perennials, basically our herbaceous curator. And so what he does in his role is all of those horticulturists that are designing for their areas, he looks at their designs and kind of
reviews them. I think he's there to assist with design ideas, but also watch outs of, we definitely killed that 5 times. And if you're going to grow that, then you have to tell him what you might be doing differently or how that's really going to work. So I will often go to him and be like, I just did this yesterday, actually. Irvin, we're getting 72s from altars. These going straight in the ground. How are they going to make it through winter without heaving? He will go back to the gardener and be like, oh, I thought you were throwing these all over, or whatever the answer was. So he is kind of a stopgap in the process of the plant selection.
He sort of consults on a lot of things. So Urban is really incredible because he has this ethos that he wants gardeners to be able to try things. He wants them to be able to experiment, to make their own mistakes. But he's sort of there as like the little Jiminy Cricket on their shoulder that's like, hey, so I see this in your design. Just a heads up that the reality of this tulip is not the same color that it is in the catalog. Like, I've seen it, been there, done that, made that mistake. And so he did such an incredible job on helping with those plant selections. He also helps me feel like I'm not completely crazy when dealing with vendors, and sometimes comes in as my backup for vendor wrangler. We are reliant on a couple of local custom growers that are generally incredible and amazing. But sometimes I am not always the best or most tactful at some of the conversations that are like, no, we actually really need this specifically this way for this reason. So that is kind of, he is amazing and swoops in and saves our butts on all of the help all the time. Best curator ever. Sherry asked if we do a lot of in-house propagation and how the tracking of that material is. And we do not. So we do not really have the facilities to do a lot of in-house prop. Our greenhouse team does some, but for the most part, we are holding things over from season to season in our basements, in our root cellar, sometimes shoving things in the offices wherever there's window space and light. But for the most part, we're not doing a ton of prep.
We're working on an overwintering greenhouse that will have some propagation option with it, but it's not there yet.
Yeah, and I think, some of the bigger institutions that have those grower ends of things choose to do it in a few different ways. Some of them are very specific on the legacy of, if they're taking cuttings from parent plants, or if it's wild collected seed material, that's one whole thing. If it's production crop for seasonal displays, that might be tracked and managed completely differently. If you haven't figured it out yet, the answer to all plant records questions is it depends. Um, and it depends on institutional need and institutional use case. So there was also a question about data import and importing common names. So I don't have the answer on the common names specifically, but what I will say is we sort of talk about our plant records program evolving and changing and growing over the last 10 years, and that is still the case. So I'm still constantly tweaking, updating, and trying to make our procedures better and more efficient. And some of that comes from when you know better, you do better. Some of that comes from just having the time and space to create and reimagine the things that we're doing. But I am relying so much more heavily on the import feature now than I was even 3 or 4 years ago. I actually just made a very scary change this year to importing all of our seasonal display material into our accessions. I used to keep that separate and make it live in the order spreadsheet, and that's kind of where it stayed. And I was like, yeah, that's too much paperwork. But I have sort of tweaked my system to be more reliant on that import arm of it, and make my import spreadsheet and my ordering spreadsheet a little bit easier to interchange. And that has drastically improved the efficiency in which I can get my accessions into the system, make big changes, etc.
This has been fantastic. Thank you both for sharing your story of how you showed up as a wet puppy and changed the world. I know you've influenced so many people in the plant records community, and so it's fun to see what you've done in your own institution. So thank you.